Hi, in this lecture, we're going to talk about using problem-solving scenarios and really get into the how-tos and how you will create these. Before we get into the how-tos, though, let's talk a little bit about the reasons that we like to use problem-solving scenarios. We distinguish the STEAM work that we do from other conceptualizations of STEAM by the clear focus and the transdisciplinary problem-solving. Developing and presenting students with STEAM scenarios in a way in which there's a problem to solve in the beginning is at the heart of every unit. So it's really important to think about this work. A well-written scenario provides the opportunities to apply this transdisciplinary instructions as it foregrounds the problem solved, not the discipline. In the next course, in STEAM Transdisciplinary Learning, we'll explain the role of transdisciplinarity in detail. But for now, just understanding that it begins with a problem and authentically integrates is really helpful. The scenario should be written in a way that is relevant and provides real-world context while connecting to the standards. In this way, the relevancy and the authenticity mean that the scenario includes an interesting, local, or publicized topic, and one that is both developmentally and intellectually appropriate. So for younger learners, the language is often a little more friendly and simple, while for older learners, say in high school, you can get some really advanced topics, and the scenarios will often be quite a bit longer. Additionally, the STEAM conceptual model offers structure and helps to think about the ways in which teachers can successfully implement each scenario and accompanying a unit for optimal learning for STEAM concepts. And so we also think about the ways in which we can provide a platform for these problem-solving skills through the problem scenarios, so that it has opportunities for students to engage in cognitive, creative, and interactional skills. So it's important to think about what the kids will be doing as you're designing the scenario. A scenario often provides multiple avenues for inquiry and has an ability to modify it easily. What we mean by that is there's not one right answer at the end of this problem. A problem-solving scenario is also a great way to think about the technology integration and the creative ways in which students can become producers and not just users of technology. And then we think back to the ways in which the reasons why we have STEAM is that it engages learners in multiple ways. And so when we use a problem-solving scenario, it really foregrounds all of this work together. So let's just revisit the parts of a scenario quickly. So what makes STEAM different? We talked about that it's problem-based. It's authentic in that what you ask the students do really helps to connect to that real-world aspect. It's inquiry-rich in that there's not one right answer. There's opportunities for student choice and in terms of maybe assessment, groupings, or topics. It has technology integrated into the STEAM unit. It provides a platform for student-directed learning in that you will facilitate instead of direct the learning. And it integrates multiple disciplines. So science, technology, engineering, arts, and math could be a part of it, but it doesn't have to include every single content area. It has an authentic assessment, and it promotes those problem-solving skills that we've been talking about. And so let's take a look at the scenario in which a high school teacher created a scenario about mosquito-borne illnesses, and that a student had been diagnosed with a particular form of mosquito-borne illness, and the students were asked to work with the CDC to identify this illness and then really to think about the ways in which we could help prevent these illnesses in the future. So let's tease apart the scenario and see where we find those strategies that we just talked about popping up in the scenario. So beginning with problem-based. So there is a new mosquito-borne illness that the scenario talks about, so it could be West Nile virus, dengue, Zika, are all real-world mosquito-borne illnesses that are not currently super prevalent in the United States, but there are cases being popped up, so it's problem-based in that it is a problem for the students to be solved. It is an authentic issue because we situated it in a local hospital that the students would be familiar with, and we also situated it in terms of this was a student, and the student was diagnosed after traveling on a family vacation and doing things that kids would be familiar with, snorkeling, hanging at the beach, those sorts of things. It's inquiry-rich in that it is looking for not just one right answer, but for students to look at the mosquito habitat, the life cycle, virus transmission, how mosquitoes are persistent in the population, and maybe even some ways in which we can reduce mosquito populations. So you can see there's lots of different pathways for the students to explore. This also incorporates technology in that it was asking students to look at some of the ways using technology that we could reduce mosquitoes, but also could be in terms of their production and their final assessment. It also includes student choice in that the way the proposals are written, the topic that they decide to focus on would be up to the students. And then in terms of discipline integration, this particular scenario has a lot of science and could be connected to a lot of science standards in terms of life cycles, virus transmission, physiology, right, the parts of the body that are affected through this, the ecological impacts as well. It incorporated math in terms of looking at the ways in which the mosquitoes' populations have changed over time. So there would definitely be some stats, or maybe they could even look at analyzing changes in percentages or where the frequency of populations are located. It's incorporated the arts in terms of designing the proposal, so thinking about the English language arts, also looking at the history of mosquitoes and how that has played a role in actually war times. So they did some lessons based around that as well. Engineering, so thinking about ways to control the spread and transmission of a virus. The students engineered different types of traps in their maker spaces to think about ways they could reduce the populations of mosquitoes. And then in terms of the authentic assessment, again, this was a proposal to be presented, and this is something that would really be done if the CDC was trying to control this population. They would want to educate the public, and they would also want to write a proposal about this work. And so for this particular STEAM scenario, students could brainstorm individual roles to solve the problem. So they were asked to be into different groups that were random, and then were asked to think about what types of roles would solve this problem. The students were really great at coming up all sorts of lists of ideas and people that they would need to be involved, such as the government officials, either the economic or tourism, a senator, a historian, or public relations would often be involved if this type of crisis has happened. A DNR representative, so looking at the implications if they're going to recommend spraying for mosquitoes, how does that affect the other wildlife in the area? Thinking about a health professional asking a doctor about the ways in which these are transmitted and safe ways to ensure that mosquitoes-borne illnesses are not transmitted. Environmental agency, so thinking about the use of pesticides and in terms of our water, soil, and air quality was also a role the students had thought of. The Olympic athlete, which I thought was really fascinating. So some of the students took on this role in trying to decide if they would travel because this was during the Olympics when there was the concern of the Zika virus. And so the students took on that role as well. And so you can see through this how real world this is, because this is the way in which these problems would really be solved, or were attempted to be solved when this problem was really happening. And so as they took on these different roles, the students then thought about the possible directions that their group could take. And so they thought about calculating the economic impacts of Zika, so comparing countries. They thought about determining who is at most at risk in a variety of situations. They looked at examining the risk factors to travel to a Zika-infected country. They determined the ethical and societal implications of Zika, which were really quite fascinating. The students actually looked at a lot of the gendered norms because of the way this disease was being portrayed in the media. They looked at the national budget to determine how we could provide aid for countries that would need it. And they examined the ecological impacts of altering an ecosystem in a variety of ways. So some of the students thought about eliminating mosquitoes altogether, and what would that do to the rest of our ecosystem. They also explored the historical roles that mosquitoes have played out in the world. As I mentioned, there are a lot of situations in which different battles have been won because of certain populations not being resistant to mosquito-borne illnesses. And then looking at the influence gender has on this issue, as I mentioned. They provided educational information about the prevention and spread of this disease to both travelers and residents. And so how is this STEAM? So it's definitely transdisciplinary in that the students began with a problem and naturally integrated the disciplines of science, math, English language arts. It definitely includes multiple inquiry products, as all the final projects did not look the same. In this case, the students took on different roles, as I mentioned, and so their products really mimicked that person's roles and perceptions of the issue. It was authentic in that this was a real-world, timely event. This was done just around the Olympics, and so this was something the students were really engaged in and fascinated with. The technology enhanced the learning in that as they incorporated technology, these were ways that would be done in the real world and really helped the students try to solve this problem instead of just technology for technology's sake. Choice was included in terms of the students were allowed to choose the different topics and inquiry lines that they investigated. And this is an authentic assessment, and then this proposal is a real-world example of what's really would be happening to solve this problem. And last, you can see how the students had to use a lot of different problem-solving skills in terms of their cognitive skills, figuring out the issue, their creative skills, thinking about the ways they would design their to try to reduce the population of mosquitoes, and interactional skills, and then this was a collaborative effort. And so when we think about how to create effective problem-solving scenarios, one of the best ways is really to begin by reviewing your standards. And so choose the standard that you like to teach via STEAM. So for me, because I'm a science teacher, I'm going to be going with science. But for you, you might think that history or beginning with English language arts is a great way to start. And so start perusing your standards and see which ones make the most sense. Not all standards tend to line up with STEAM scenarios. Then begin to research a local or timely issue related to the standards. So there's some good websites such as the New York Times Science and Technology sections are full of relevant, really interesting issues. The PBS website is really great for younger learners, and TED Talks often inspire a lot of innovative questions to think about. I also spend some time scanning local newspapers, seeing what pops up so that you can use that as a draw-in for many of your learners. There's a lot of great radio programs and certainly podcasts right now. Tech Nation, All Things Considered, On Point, or Youth Radio are all available for free and online. So those are great to listen to and see if there's something that could spark a STEAM scenario. I often think about those hot topics or controversial issues, as we mentioned with the Zika virus, or thinking about the ways social media is being used. Students are often really engaged when it is a timely topic, and this could be a great starting point for your scenario. Another great idea is to poll your students. Ask them for the list of topics or things that they would be interested in. I'm often really surprised at which the depth and the level with kids are concerned about the events that are happening behind them. The next thing to do is write the problem in scenario form. And so when you begin to do this, I often think about ways in which you can ensure that it has more than one solution. And then create a driving question. This driving question will guide the entire unit, and it's something to reflect back on, right? And it also helps you to think about, is what I'm asking the kids to do, is that connected to this driving question? Review the pieces of STEAM. Are you missing any? If you're missing pieces, but adding them in makes it less realistic, don't add them in. If you do, students will often recognize that you're trying to force it and it no longer feels real world to them. So it's better to leave those out. Then incorporate the assessment. This is often where you can ensure the technology piece is included and student choice. Ensure that the assessment is something that would really be done to solve the problem. And then review the entire scenario again. Are there ways to make it more realistic? Are there elements that can be simplified? Take a stab at that. At the end of this, you should have a nice draft of your STEAM problem scenario. At the end, it's often helpful to collaborate with somebody else about this as well. So if you have somebody you can run these ideas by, they will often come up with great ways for you to think about this STEAM scenario. So we have some final tips for creating the STEAM scenarios. One thing is start simple. Often teachers will want to create this huge unit that will last weeks and weeks, and we find that's often a mistake. Students get frustrated that it drags on forever, and teachers often get frustrated because the students seem to be taking a long time to be doing these STEAM units. And so we suggest to start simple and think about no more than 10 to 15 instructional time periods. And start small. As I mentioned, thinking about a shorter instructional unit is a great way just to get a handle on STEAM, what you feel comfortable with. Are there pieces that you need a little more practice with? Definitely makes it more manageable. Think about starting with multi versus transdisciplinarity. If you're a science teacher and you're not comfortable with integrating other disciplines, start small again and think about ways in which you can bring in disciplines authentically. You're not going to need to assess students on standards that are content areas that are outside your classroom, but it's a great way to start to think about the ways you can make something more real world by bringing in those problems. At this point, you're ready to get started on your own STEAM problems scenario. I can't wait to see what you come up with.